Mac Engel Angle podcast, accept no substitutes. But if there are any, can you please tell me about them because I'd be curious to watch. I am very excited about introducing my guest for this latest episode of the Angle. He is Mr. Jim Lampley. And Jim, for a long, long time, was one of the precious few faces of television sports broadcasting. You probably knew him because he had fantastic hair and an incredible ability to enunciate periods, commas, semicolons, just as easily as he would consonants and vowels. No one enunciated like Jim Lampley. Guy did it for 50 years. 50 years Jim Lampley was in the game, and he called damn near everything. For a long time, he was the face of the Winter Olympics, the Summer Olympics, along with National Football League, baseball, basketball, everything. USFL, Wimbledon, NASCAR, HBO Real Sports. I've got the list here. It just goes on and on. Well, Jim's back at it. And he is back with the sport that he is probably most well known. I'm talking about boxing. Jim, for a long time, was the voice of HBO Sports broadcasts of the sport of boxing. And that covered Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, everybody. If there was a big fight, chances were great Jim was the guy on the call. Jim will be a part of the telecast for this Saturday night's big fight in Las Vegas, Nevada, that will be carried on PayPerView.com. No subscription required. That's actually a big deal. PayPerView.com, when Canelo Alvarez, the pride of Mexico, takes on Edgar Berlanga. That's right, Canelo Alvarez versus Edgar Berlanga. Saturday night in Las Vegas from the T-Mobile Center. You can find Jim Lampley there. But before you do, please welcome the one, the only, the star of Blades of Glory, Jim Lampley. And actually, you and I have something in common in the fact we have both been college teachers, college professors. So,
really?
Yes.
Where did you teach?
I did as an adjunct at TCU, and I did as an adjunct at SMU. And so when I saw that you did it at North Carolina, Chapel Hill, I had a laugh. I was like, I wonder if he hated grading as much as I did.
And in fact, I hated it so much that I very, very purposely and at enormous effort created a 60-question multiple choice final so that I would not have to comb through several dozen unreadable essay answers to try to determine what would be in some part subjective grades for them. I wanted to simplify it, so I went to the difficulty, and it is difficulty, of creating a comprehensive multiple choice final. And I discovered that the most difficult part of that enterprise, and maybe the hardest thing I had to do as a teacher, is to concoct plausible answers that are incorrect for multiple choice questions. And I got wildly creative about it, et cetera, et cetera. Prouder and prouder. Oh, this will really hang them up. So, there was gamesmanship.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I was teaching a course called Evolution of Storytelling in American Electronic News Media. I very purposely, trying to be an academic, stayed away from sports and taught a course based on something meaningful in our society, which is how news messages are developed and ultimately distributed to the audience. And one of the things that I harped on to them over and over was that they had to observe and pay attention to how evolution in electronics, evolution in management systems, ownership, personnel, et cetera, all sorts of factors like that would ultimately affect the way stories were constructed and told. That was really basically kind of the heart of the course. And And now we live in a world where that becomes so clear and so obvious. And eventually, after 5 semesters of teaching it, I was simply too frustrated by my inability to puncture their affiliation with social media.
I don't think you can.
About they
Yeah,
can't.
I can.
And it's where
Yep.
they live. And a couple times a semester, I would come in and start the course by saying, if you wake up every morning and before you come to campus for your classes, you go to your preferred social media platform for your first dose of news every day, you are asking to be lied to, you're asking to be misled, you're asking to be subdivided and colonized. You are sacrificing a lot of your agency as an individual in the society with regard to meaningful information if that's what you do. Blank faces. Totally blank faces.
Yep.
Yep, you got it. No response. So after a while, I said, okay, I'll take a little time off here and go work for PPV.com.
Okay, well, you're working Saturday night. You got the next Canelo Alvarez fight on the card, so to speak. And as someone who has been around boxing for a long time, I am sure you have heard this expression that I'm going to say to you a lot. And my answer on this has evolved. I'm sure yours has too. Jim, when somebody says to you, boxing is dead, nobody cares anymore, I don't buy it. What do you say to that declaration?
It's been dead for 120 years.
You ain't that old.
And we revive it on a week by week basis. And we revive it because there is a persistent, devoted, loyal audience for whom it is in the blood and they won't let it go, regardless of all of the blemishes
Yeah.
and flies in the ointment, regardless of all of the demonstrable inequities and inadequacies that the sport reflects. It's still somehow necessary to our global constitution. It's not just necessary here in the United States. It's necessary to virtually every culture in the world. And so Larry Merchant, to me, had the single best and most succinct response to that. Boxing can't fix it, can't kill it.
Okay, so having been around the fight game for as long as you have, Jim, has the sport really changed that much?
No. When I first started covering boxing in the middle 80s at
Oh,
ABC,
yeah.
um, there were complaints about governing body bias. There were complaints about inaccurate scoring and indeed crooked scoring. There were complaints about fighters who simply wouldn't take the risk of fighting the best possible opposition as opposed to other fighters far more admirable and laudable who went out of their way to fight the best possible opposition. And all the same conditions that we see now and write about and talk about now, they were there 40 years ago when I first began covering boxing, and they're still there now.
So you've seen one of the challenges, you briefly alluded to it there, that we've seen in the sport is getting the best fighters to fight each other. Or sometimes the best fighter, there just isn't another fighter on his level. So it doesn't really matter who you put in the ring against him. It's just really not that close. And I think there are two guys out there right now, and I hope you can address this, that people like me would love to see get in the ring. And that's Canelo and Bud Crawford. I know that there's a lot of particulars around this matchup, even potentially even being discussed. Is it even realistic, Jim, that we could think that maybe one day these guys will actually fight each other?
Maybe. It depends. I mean, now you have this Saudi Arabian sheikh
Oh, yeah.
who wants to follow in the footsteps of Tex Rickard, Don King, Bob Arum, and become a sort of individual kingmaker in the sport. And he professes to have a very strong desire to see Canelo fight Terence Crawford and tried to get it done this time around. And look, I covered Crawford's ascent from a last minute substitute opponent on a top ranked card, pay-per-view card, undercard in Las Vegas to where he is now at the competitive peak of the sport. But even I have to acknowledge that the notion that a 147-pound fighter can, within a very short, manageable period of time, go up 21 pounds to 168 and be competitive against a guy who's been fighting at 168 for years and has claimed the mantle of best dollar-for-dollar fighter in the sport while doing so is perhaps a stretch. I'm not sure that I'm going to see circumstances under which I think Terence Crawford can beat Canelo Alvarez. More pertinent to a lot of fans right now is whether David Benavidez could beat him. And there are quite a number of fans who firmly believe that David Benavidez would and could beat Canelo. The story here is he's not fighting either one of them. He's not fighting David Benavidez. He's not fighting Terence Crawford. He's not fighting David Morrell. He's fighting a guy who has a certain set of credentials on paper, but no ringside expert I know really buys the argument that Edgar Berlanga is a high-level, credible opponent against Canelo Alvarez in this circumstance. This looks like a relatively perfunctory Canelo Alvarez win. However, I will say this. Berlanga has terrific straight-ahead punching power. If he catches the right person at the right time, he could hit hard enough to knock almost anybody out. Canelo, I don't know. Canelo has the best punch resistance in the sport. So there's something to watch here. If Berlanga is able to land, is he able to hurt Canelo, which virtually nobody else has been able to do. But unquestionably, the vast majority of the knowledgeable and intelligent audience would rather have seen Canelo fight David Benavidez, would rather have seen Canelo fight David Morrell, would rather have seen Canelo fight Terence Crawford, even though Crawford would functionally be coming up 21 pounds to do it.
We're seeing some sports now kind of tip their toe into pay-per-view models. For the longest time, it was boxing, and then it was combat sports like UFC. And I'm dying to get your thoughts on this because you've been in the fight game for so long. Was the pay-per-view model that boxing embraced decades ago good for the sport, or do you think, as some critics have suggested, that it ultimately hurt its growth and popularity?
In terms of broad-based competition and maximum public exposure for all of the fighters, not just one or two, whom the public might want to see, it would have been better if we could have kept the Gillette Friday night fights forever. We couldn't keep the Gillette Friday night fights forever. Commercial television in that form wasn't going to exist forever. We have long ago embarked on a path toward the highest possible payoff, maximum intensity, based on what is the highest price consumers will pay to see the fight. So that was the winner in the competition between delivery systems. Ultimately, the paymasters, the people who handled the money, wanted to see the largest possible payoff for each event, and that's led us down the road toward pay-per-view and what most consumers would call extraordinarily high prices for seeing fights of this caliber. Are we going to be able to put the genie back into the bottle? Probably not. This is where we are. This is probably where we're going to stay until there's some concrete evidence that this is going to kill boxing. And again, can't fix it, can't kill it.
Okay, Jim, I want to, putting the genie back in the bottle, I want to go in a time machine and go back to when you were starting out, a young Jim Lampley. You did something that I don't see many sportscasters or even announcers do, which is separate yourself from the pack with a delivery that is truly unique because your enunciation is better than anybody else. And I'm talking Bob Costas, you name the guy. Jim Lampley's voice and delivery stood above everybody else. I'm not saying that just because you're on the screener with me. I'm saying that because I mean it. And I've even tried to emulate it sometimes. Was it deliberate, Jim, that you said, I'm going to do it this way? And, or was it something that just sort of organically happened?
It was built in. There's no other way that I could have or would have done it. I was raised by a twice widowed
Wow.
mother who was left with me when my father died when I was 5 years old. That was the second of her two Air Force bomber pilot husbands to die. She's the person who walked me down a hallway at an adult party in Hendersonville, North Carolina in 1955 and said, sit down here. I was 6 years old. Sit here. Watch this television set. You're going to be watching the Gillette Friday night fights. Sugar Ray Robinson versus Bobo Olson for the middleweight championship of the world. If your father was still alive, this is what you would be doing. And in the next 90 minutes, a man named Don Dunphy is going to teach you everything you need to know about boxing. If you were to go back and somehow access Don Dunphy's fight calls, I think you would hear a version and maybe even an identical template for the kind of careful enunciation and specifically careful grammar and language discipline that I have brought to this solely and simply because my mother schooled me to be that way. There wasn't any individual elementary school teacher who did that. There wasn't anybody else in Hendersonville, North Carolina who did that. Certainly I could mimic my grandmother's colorful language for you. That was something entirely different. But at the end of the day, I don't know why my mother was that way, but she was. I also don't know why my mother, raised in a relatively poor Irish household all her life in Memphis, Tennessee, developed an absolutely maniacal bent toward racial equality,
Wow.
toward proper respect for black Americans, toward never being a part of the kind of racism that was portrayed by her parents and by my father's parents, by, as simple a thing as her saying to me, you will say Negro and you will not say it any other way. So I don't know how it was that my mother reached that point, but it led to her, for instance, saying to me, you need to watch Sugar Ray Robinson because he's the best fighter in boxing, and oh, by the way, he's a dancer in the ring. And that ultimately led to me falling in love with Cassius Clay at the 1960 Summer Olympics in Rome. And it's all a part of a chemistry that led to me arguing with my grandparents about race relations over and over and over all the way through my childhood, and in every way constantly reinforcing my bent toward that. And, all sports have played a role in helping the United States to achieve a far more equanimitous atmosphere with regard to race relations than was the case when I was 5 or 6 years old. But boxing in particular was a pathway toward that, and I'm really glad that my mother sent me down that
What
path.
a hell of an answer. I was not expecting that at all. Okay, so you go from watching those fights on Friday night to calling some of the most significant fights in the history of the sport. And one that I can remember, of course, I can still hear your call. And down goes Tyson. Brawling willingly. I can still hear your.
Actually, may I correct you
Oh,
slightly?
no. Did I get it
Okay.
wrong?
The call was, if you're talking about Tyson
Yes.
Douglas, the call was Mike Tyson has been knocked out. And in just about that tone, I was very specifically reaching at that moment for as understated an understatement as I could possibly prevent. Because the very first live prize fight that I ever attended was February 25, 1964, Cassius Clay versus Sonny Liston, Miami
You were there?
Beach. And I was conscious when I first started calling fights at ABC in the late 80s and then eventually moved over to HBO at the end of that decade. I was quite conscious that I had seen the biggest upset in the history of boxing the very first time I ever went to a live prize fight. So fast forward from there all the way to February 10, 1990 in Tokyo, and Buster Douglas flattens Tyson, and Tyson is lying on the canvas. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, the first fight that I ever attended was the biggest upset in the history of boxing. And now here is the fight which will succeed it in the lore of the sport. This is the biggest upset in the history of boxing. What can I possibly say here that amplifies this to the degree that it needs to be amplified? Quick answer in my mind, nothing. So I had been developing a friendship with a very famous actor. And I had asked that very famous actor, Jack, when you get ready to do the biggest scene in the movie, when you get ready to do the fulcrum moment, when you're going to the set to say you can't handle the truth, what do you have in your mind as a mantra? And he said to me, Lamp, don't overact. Same thing I've been thinking about ever since I first went to acting school a long time ago. So in my mind, as I'm watching the referee in Tokyo counting Tyson out, I hear, don't overact. Wow. And my response to don't overact was, Mike Tyson has been knocked out. And my beloved colleague, Larry Merchant, who was never overwhelmingly or unnecessarily complimentary of my work, years later, Larry Merchant said to me, that's the greatest call in the history of sports television. And I said, why would you say that, Larry? He said, for the elegant understatement of it all, for your ability to resist being hyperbolic in the way that anybody else would have been hyperbolic based on what you were seeing, recognizing that there was no way you could gild that lily, let it speak for itself. Mike Tyson has been knocked out. To get that kind of a compliment from someone of Larry's stature and eminence in sports journalism, pretty big for me.
So fast forward to another significant upset that you called, and that is Michael Moorer being knocked out by an aging George Foreman that I had seen in a documentary where you talked about it, Jim. You were prepared for it because George had prepared you for it. But when it happened, when he landed that just crushing right hand to Moorer's chin and knocked him out, all the preparation you could have done, could you really have prepared to call what you were saying?
Well, I didn't believe it was going to happen, even though he had told me on 2 or 3 occasions, and the words were always the same. You watch, Jim. He will come and stand in front of me at a moment late in the fight and let me knock him out. Always those words. He will come and stand in front of me and let me knock him out. Now, if you go back to YouTube and look at the video, it's
amazing.
Yep. If you put what you see together with those words. So as I'm watching the referee countdown, Joe Cortez is 6-5-4. I've got to think of something to say. And what I hear in my head is George telling me, you watch, come and stand in front of me and let me knock him out. And what I say is, I blurted out, it happened. It happened. That was unplanned. That is the most well-remembered and most repeated by fans of any of my boxing calls. To this day, I can walk down a hallway here at the MGM Grand, walk past 3 people in the hall, and somebody will turn around over his shoulder and say, it happened. And I'm very, very lucky that it turned out that way, that George, in effect, was the producer who set me up to do the right thing with that call.
So that was basically a real-life movie, and you have been in actual Hollywood movies. And I'm sure there are people, Jim, who know you for those roles more than maybe they do for your sports commentating. You did a part in Rocky Balboa, which was Sylvester Stallone's last turn in the ring as Rocky. And then, of course, you did my favorite, Blades of Glory. When Sly set you up, because I had got a chance to talk to Stu Nahan once quite accidentally, and Stu was the first guy who called the Rocky movies, was the boxing announcer who called the Rocky movies. And he told me the story behind it. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. So when he hired you, when you're cast as the ringside announcer, to call Rocky Balboa's final fight. Was there a script, Jim, or it was, hey, you're a pro, call the fight? Because that's what he did with Stu Nahan.
No script.
No script.
I'm in, I think there are 17 major feature films in which I appear. Almost all of them are in some way related to boxing, and I never actually employed a script or was asked to employ a script in calling fight scenes for movies. It was always, okay, sit down and either watch a video playback and do what you do, or watch the actors in the ring and do what you do. Whether I was doing it alone or whether I was with Max and Roy, whatever it was always improvised because the producers and directors were asking us to give them a quality, genuine, as though live, blow by blow. So that's what I did. And I always tell young sportscasters or aspiring young sportscasters, if you want to be in the movies, if that's an ancillary goal here, cover boxing, because there are many more boxing movies than there are for any other
Right.
sport.
Yep.
Think about it. The expanse of territory and the number of characters whom you have to be able to cover on camera to do a football movie or a baseball movie, far more difficult than two guys in the ring facing each other in an enclosed space. That's why there are so many more boxing movies than other kinds of sports movies, because they're so much easier
Right.
to shoot.
So I got two more questions for you. I'll let you go. So
Good.
you had a great role as yourself in Blades of Glory, which is a Will Ferrell comedy, and some of the dialogue is nothing like I think I would ever hear Jim Lampley say.
I wish you could have heard the dialogue that didn't make it into the final.
Was it all scripted? Did you take an objection to any of it, and did you improv any of it?
Some of it was script, some of it was suggested, but a lot of it was just stuff that we did. Scott Hamilton and I had a good relationship. We knew each other fairly well. I was in the trailer that morning, had shown up bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, 8:30 in the morning, ready to go. Scott showed up at about 9:30. He had just gotten off a plane. I forget where he was or what he was doing. He came to my trailer, kind of frantic, said, "Lamps, do you have any idea what we're doing here?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Did you read the script?" I said, "Yes, I read the script. I know what it is we're doing." He said, "So what are we doing?" I said, "Scott, we're doing every bad gay figure skating joke in the history of bad gay figure skating jokes." Okay? And he looked at me, thought for a second, and he said, "Lance, there are no bad gay figure skating jokes. There's a whole lot of gay figure skating jokes." I said, "Well, we're doing them all." And that's what the movie turned out to be.
Okay, this is the last question for you. I'm sure you've had this before for a long time now. When a young person, let's say 20 years old, and they're starting out, and they come up to you and they say, "Mr. Lampley, I would love to do what you do." What do you tell them?
I tell them that there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of them who know sports, care about sports, pay attention to sports, are probably just as devoted to sports as they are. If my mother had been able to put into a handbook all the things that she taught me when I was a child, first and foremost would have been, it's about the English language. It's about your ability to use the English language. It's about grammar. It's about syntax. It's about vocabulary. It's about word choice. All of those things are far more the platform on which you're going to rise and fall than your knowledge of sports. So in order to be confident in doing this, in order to be able to be the centerpiece of a 3-hour live telecast in which anything can happen because sports are chemical, organic, and idiosyncratic, and in every single fight or game you're going to see something that you might not have seen before, the way to be confident is to have maximum command of the English language. I'm 75 years old. I get up and take a stab at Wordle and connections every morning because you can never stop learning this language. It is vast and it creates millions of different expressionistic possibilities, and I never want to lose my grasp of that if I can keep it.
Jim, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. I've been a great admirer of yours for a long, long time. Thank you very much. I hope you have a great call. My best to you and your family. Continued good health, and I hope you work for as long as you want. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. And can you wait a second so I can show you something?
Absolutely.
So that I'm not missing any possible trick
here we go.
This is my autobiography book.
Oh, that's outstanding.
This book will be published sometime early in 2025, as I understand it. Ben Bella Books in New York.
Did you write it, or did you have somebody who wrote it with you,
You can see
Jim?
the person on the cover. To whatever degree you can help proliferate anticipation or interest in, maybe I make 27 cents for every copy that's sold. I don't know. At any rate, it'll be fun. So I just wanted to show you that. And thank you so much for your time, your attention, and your recognition of what it's been that's important to me.
Thank you, Jim. It's been an honor. Thanks so much for your time. Have a great call Saturday night. Further ado, please welcome the great, the one, the only, Mr. Jim Nance. Oh, fuck!